Hello, everybody, and welcome to Harper Reads. I am Harper of the Harper Reads. Today I'm going to be reading The Adventures of Ulysses by Bernard Ebslin. I will pause in between the chapters and you guys can ask me any questions or correct me on any of my pronunciations because it's ancient Greek and I will probably get some of them wrong. I know some of the more commonly used ones because I have seen enough. I've seen Troy and those kind of things on the movies, so I'll probably pronounce them that way. And I will start and just dive right in. All right. So this is The Adventures of Ulysses. It has this handy dandy little map here at the beginning. I like to come back and reference that every so often just so I can kind of see where he's at in his journey. And let's go ahead and read the prologue. The adventures of Ulysses begin many years before the opening of this book. He was the master strategist of the Greek forces in their war against Troy, the war that started with an apple, ended with a horse, and was fought by 1,000 kings for the love of a single woman. It left an ancient city in flames that still burn in man's imagination after 3,000 years. The war started when Peleus, mightiest hero of his time, was married to Thetis, the most beautiful naiad that ever sported among the waves or fled the embrace of Poseidon. It was a magnificent wedding, attended by all the gods on Olympus. Unfortunately, however, Thetis had neglected to send an invitation to Eris, lady of discord and sister to the god of war. It was an omission that was to cost a river of blood, for Eris came without invitation and threw upon the banquet table a golden apple inscribed, "To the fairest." Mischievous words. The apple was claimed immediately by Hera, queen of the gods, Athene, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. The feud between the three goddesses waxed so bitter that no god dared attempt mediation, but passed judgment on to Paris, a shepherd boy of Troy, the son of King Priam, whose royal birth had been kept secret. Paris was said to be the most beautiful of all the lads of the inner sea. Bribes came his way immediately. Hera offered him power, promising to make him the mightiest king the world had ever seen. Athene offered him wisdom, all the lore of heaven and earth, and all the lore beyond death too. All that has been written and spoken, and also that too secret to be uttered, would be his. Aphrodite said little. She came close to him and whispered in his ear. When she had finished whispering, he gave her the apple. She smiled and kissed him. Hera and Athene flew off, screaming with their rage. What the goddess Aphrodite had whispered to Paris was a promise that he should have any woman he looked upon with desire. She then recommended the most desirable, a Spartan queen named Helen, who the goddess said was the mortal most resembling herself. In fact, Helen was by way being a relative, for she had been born of Leda, who had been loved by Zeus, disguised as a swan. And so she herself had the radiant stature of the gods, a swan's soft muscularity, and her mother's eyes. Paris straightway gave up being a shepherd and resumed his rank as Prince of Troy. He demanded to his doting father a treasure ship and a piratical crew. Thereupon he sailed to Sparta on a diplomatic mission to King Menelaus, Helen's husband. Paris and Helen met at a state banquet. By dawn, she was aboard his ship, and it was sailing for Troy. Now Helen had been courted by all the kings and princes of the Greek islands. Her father had hesitated long before allowing her to accept any suitor. He was afraid that the rejected suitors would band together to destroy the successful ones, and himself and his kingdom in the bargain. So Helen flirted with all of them, encouraged all of them, and accepted none. Finally, Ulysses, who was one of the suitors, offered a plan. All Helen's admirers would swear a mighty oath to refrain from murdering the successful suitor, and would join to defend Helen and her husband, whoever he might be, against any attack. Thereupon, Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, most powerful of the Greek chieftains. Thus it was that, when Paris made off with Helen, 1,000 kings were summoned to keep their oath. They assembled a huge fleet and sailed for Troy. The Greeks camped outside the walls of Troy and for 10 years tried to fight their way into the city, but the walls were strong and the Trojans brave. The defenders were led by King Priam's 50 warrior sons, and great Hector was their chief. And even after Hector was killed by the Greek hero Achilles, the Trojans refused to be defeated until they were tricked into defeating themselves. The author of that fatal trick was Ulysses, sharpest tactician among the invaders. The Greeks pretended to lift their siege. They struck their tents, boarded their ships, and sailed around a headland out of sight, where they anchored and waited until nightfall. Behind them on the beach, they had left a giant wooden horse. The Trojans reacted just as Ulysses had calculated. They began to celebrate and quickly lost their wits. They thought the wooden horse an offering to Poseidon, god of the sea, and dragged it through the gates into the city so as to anger Poseidon against the Greeks and spoil the voyage home. But the wooden horse was hollow, and so artfully made that Ulysses and a company of armed warriors were able to hide inside and remain undetected as the horse was rolled into the city. That night, as Troy slept, the Greeks crawled out of their hiding place, killed the Trojan sentries, and opened the gates to the Greek army, which had sailed back in the darkness. It was a complete surprise. Troy was taken, its fighting men slaughtered, its women and children enslaved. Then Ulysses sailed for home, his 3 ships loaded with booty. But victory never comes cheap. Poseidon's anger had indeed been kindled. He roused the winds and tides against Ulysses, and sent word to island ogres and monsters of the deep. And for 10 long years, the great voyager had to battle his way through the worst perils that the imagination of an offended god could devise. This is the story of that voyage. All right, there's the prologue. All right. We are on to the Lotus Eaters. All right, so like I said, I'm going to come back and kind of reference this map at the beginning here. So, see here. Oh, a little too close. Boop. All right, over here. So there's Troy over there. Right now, they're on this part. So they got blown out into the open sea, and they're coming all the way over here to the land of the Lotus Eaters. So that's where we are right now. All right. Now, at this time, the shore of Libya was known as the land where Morpheus plays. Who was Morpheus? He was a young god, son of Hypnos, god of sleep, and nephew of Hades. It was his task to fly around the world from nightfall to dawn, scattering sleep. His father, Hypnos, mixed the colors of sleep for him, making them dark and thick and sad. For, he said, it is a little death you lay upon man each night, my son, to prepare him for the kingdom of death. But his aunt Persephone sewed him a secret pocket full of bright things and said, it is not death you scatter, but repose. Hang the walls of sleep with bright pictures, so that man may not know death before he dies. These bright pictures were called dreams, and Morpheus became fascinated by the way a little corner of man's mind remained awake in sleep and played with the colors he had hung, mixing them, pulling them apart, making new pictures. It seemed to him that these were fantastic, colored shadows the sleepers painted were the most beautiful, most puzzling things he had ever seen, and he wanted to know more about how they came to be. He went to Persephone and said, I need a flower that makes sleep. It must be purple and black. But there should be one petal streaked with fire red, the petal to make dreams. Persephone smiled and moved her long white hair in the air. Between her fingers a flower blossomed, and she gave it to him. Here it is, Morpheus. black and purple like sleep, with one petal of fire red for dreams. We will call it Lotus." Morpheus took the flower and planted it in Libya, where it is always summer. The flower grew in clusters, smelling deliciously of honey. The people ate nothing else. They slept all the time, except when they were gathering flowers. Morpheus watched over them, reading their dreams. It was toward Lotusland that Ulysses and his men were blown by the gale. The wind fell while they were still offshore. The sky cleared, the sea calmed, a hot sun beat down. To Ulysses, dizzy with fatigue, weak with hunger, the sky and the water and the air between seemed to flow together in one hot blueness. He shook his head, trying to shake away the hot blue haze, and growled to his men to unship the oars and row toward land. The exhausted men bent to the oars, and the ship crawled over the fire-blue water. With their last strength, they pulled the ships up on the beach, past the high tide mark, and they lay down and went to sleep. As they slept, the lotus eaters came out of the forest. Their arms were heaped with flowers, which they piled around the sleeping men in great blue and purple bouquets, so that they might have flowers to eat when they awoke, for these people were very gentle and hospitable. The men awoke and smelled the warm honey smell of the flowers and ate them in great handfuls like honeycomb, and fell asleep again. Morpheus hovered over the sleeping men and read their dreams. "These men have done terrible things," the god whispered to himself. "Their dreams are full of gold and blood and fire. Such sleep will not rest them." And he mixed them some cool green and silver dreams of home. The nightmares faded. Wounded Trojans stopped screaming. Troy stopped burning. They saw their wives smile and heard their children laugh. Saw the green wheat growing in their own fields. They dreamed of home, awoke and were hungry, ate the honeyed lotus flowers, and fell into a deeper sleep. Then Morpheus came to Ulysses, who was stretched on the sand, a little apart from the rest. He studied his face, the wide grooved brow, the sunken eyes, the red hair, the jutting chin, and he said to himself, "This man is a hero. Terrible are his needs, sudden his deeds, and his dreams must be his own. I cannot help him." So Morpheus mixed no colors for Ulysses' sleep, but let him dream his own dreams, and read them as they came. He hovered above the sleeping king and could not leave. "What monsters he makes," he said to himself. "Look at that giant with the single eye in the middle of his forehead, and that terrible spider woman with all those legs. Ah, the things he dreams, this angry sleeper! What bloody mouths! What masts falling, sails ripping! What rocks and reefs, what shipwrecks, how many deaths!" Ulysses awoke, choking out of a terrible nightmare. It seemed to him that in his sleep he had seen the whole voyage laid out before him, and seen his ship sinking, his men drowning. Monsters had crowded about him, clutching, writhing. He sat up and looked about. His men lay asleep among heaped flowers. As he watched, one opened his eyes, raised himself up on an elbow, took a handful of flowers, stuffed them into his mouth, and immediately fell asleep again. Ulysses smelled the honey sweetness and felt an overpowering hunger. He took some of the flowers and raised them to his mouth. As their fragrance grew stronger, he felt his eyelids drooping, his arms growing heavy, and he thought, "It is these flowers that are making us sleep. Their scent alone brings sleep. I must not eat them." But he could not put them down. His hand would not obey him. Exerting all the bleak force of his will, he grasped his right hand with his left, as if it belonged to someone else, and one by one forced open his fingers and let the flowers fall. Then he dragged himself to his feet and walked slowly into the sea. He went under and arose snorting. His head had cleared, but when he went up on the beach, the sweet fragrance rose like an ether and made him dizzy again. "I must work swiftly," he said. One by one, he carried the sleeping men to the ships and propped them on their benches. His strength was going. The honey smell was invading him, making him droop with sleep. He took his knife and, cutting sharp splinters of wood to prop open his eyelids, staggered back among the men. He worked furiously now, lifting them on his shoulders, carrying them two at a time, throwing them into the ships. Finally, the beach was cleared. The men lolled, sleeping upon the benches. Then, all by himself, using his last strength, he pushed the ships into the water. When the ships were afloat in the shallow water, he lashed one to another with rawhide line from his own ship in front. Then he raised his sail and took the helm. The wind was blowing from the southwest. It filled his sail. The line grew taut. A file of ships moved away from Lotus Land. The men began to awake from their dreams of home and found themselves upon the empty sea again. But the long sleep had rested them, and they took up their tasks with new strength. Ulysses kept the helm, grim and unsmiling, for he knew that what he had seen painted on the walls of his sleep was meant to come true, and that he was sailing straight into a nightmare. Alright, here is one of the most famous sections of the whole Odyssey, the Cyclops' cave. Give me 1 second, I'm going to take a drink here. I'm not used to reading out loud. I should have water. That's what I should have. All right. Hold on here, 2 seconds. After he had rescued his crew from Lotus Land, Ulysses found that he was running from one trouble into another. They were still at sea, and there was no food for the fleet. The men were hungry and getting dangerous. Ulysses heard them grumbling. He should have left us there in Lotus Land. At least when you're asleep, you don't know you're hungry. Why did he have to come and wake us up? He knew that unless he found food for them, very soon he would be facing a mutiny. That part of the Aegean Sea was dotted with islands. On every one of them was a different kind of enemy. The last thing Ulysses wanted to do was go ashore, but there was no other way of getting food. He made a landfall on a small mountainous island. He was very careful. He had the ships of the fleet moor offshore and selected 12 of his bravest men as a landing party. They beached their skiff and struck inland. It was a wild, hilly place full of boulders with very few trees. It seemed deserted. Then Ulysses glimpsed something moving across the valley on the slope of a hill. He was too far off to see what they were, but he thought that they must be goats since the hill was so steep. And if they were goats, they had to be caught. So the men headed downhill, meaning to cross the valley and climb the slope. Ulysses had no way of knowing it. But in the entire sea, this was the very worst island on which the small party could have landed, for here lived the Cyclopses. Huge, savage creatures, tall as trees, each one with one eye in the middle of his forehead. Once, long ago, they had lived in the bowels of Olympus, forging thunderbolts for Zeus. But he had punished them for some fault, exiling them to this island where they had forgotten all their smithcraft and did nothing but fight with each other for the herd of wild goats, trying to find enough food to fill their huge bellies. Best of all, they liked storms. Storms meant shipwrecks. Shipwrecks meant sailors struggling in the sea, who could be plucked out and eaten raw, and the thing they loved best in the whole world was human flesh. The largest and the fiercest of the hungriest of all the Cyclops on the island was one named Polyphemus. He kept constant vigil on his mountain in fair weather or foul. If he spotted a ship and there was no storm to help, he would dive into the sea and swim underwater, coming up underneath the ship and overturning it. Then he would swim off with his pockets full of sailors. On this day, he could not believe his luck when he saw a boat actually landing on the beach, and 13 meaty-looking sailors disembark and begin to march toward his cave. But there they were, climbing out of the valley now, up the slope of the hill, right toward the cave. He realized they must be hunting his goats. The door of the cave was an enormous slab of stone. He shoved this aside so that the cave could invitingly be open, casting a faint glow of firelight upon the dusk. Over the fire, on a great spit, 8 goats were turning and roasting. The delicious savors of the cooking drifted from the cave. Polyphemus lay down behind a huge boulder and waited. The men were halfway up the slope of the hill when they smelled the meat roasting. They broke into a run. Ulysses tried to restrain them, but they paid no heed. They were too hungry. They raced to the mouth of the cave and dashed in. Ulysses drew his sword and hurried after them. When he saw the huge fireplace and the 8 goats spitted like sparrows, his heart sank because he knew that they had come into reach of something much larger than themselves. However, the men were giving no thought to anything but food. They flung themselves on the spit and tore into the goat meat, smearing their hands and faces with sizzling fat, too hungry to feel pain as they crammed the hot meat into their mouths. There was a loud rumbling sound. The cave darkened. Ulysses whirled about. He saw that the door had been closed. The far end of the cavern was too dark to see anything, but then, amazed, aghast, he saw what looked like a huge red lantern far above, coming closer. Then he saw the great shadow of a nose under it, and the gleam of teeth. He realized that the lantern was a great flaming eye. Then he saw the whole giant, tall as a tree, with huge fingers reaching out of the shadows, fingers bigger than bailing hooks. They closed around 2 sailors and hauled them screaming into the air. As Ulysses and his horrified men watched, the great hand bore the struggling little men to the giant's mouth. He ate them, still wriggling, the way a cat eats a grasshopper. He ate them clothes and all, growling over their raw bones. The men had fallen to their knees and were whimpering like terrified children. But Ulysses stood there, sword in hand, his agile brain working more swiftly than it ever had before. "Greetings," he called. "May I know to whom we are indebted for such hospitality?" The giant belched and spat out buttons. "I am Polyphemus," he growled. "This is my cave, my mountain, and everything that comes here is mine. I do hope you can all stay to dinner. There are just enough of you to make a meal. Ho, ho, ho." And he laughed a great, choking, phlegmy laugh, swiftly lunged and caught another sailor, whom he lifted into the air and held before his face. "Wait!" cried Ulysses. "What for?" "You won't enjoy him that way. He is from Attica, where the olives grow. He was raised on olives and has a very delicate, oily flavor. But to appreciate it, you must taste the wine of the country." "Wine? What is wine?" "It is a drink made from pressed grapes. Have you never drunk it?" "We drink nothing but ox blood and buttermilk here." "Ah, you do not know what you have missed, gentle Polyphemus. Meat eaters in particular love wine. Here, try it for yourself." Ulysses unslung from his belt a full flask of unwatered wine. He gave it to the giant, who put it to his lips and gulped. He coughed violently and stuck the sailor in a little niche high up in the cave wall, then leaned his great slab of a face toward Ulysses and said, "What did you say this drink was?" "Wine. A gift of the gods to man, to make women look better and food taste better. And now it is my gift to you." "It's good, very good." He put the flask to his lips and swallowed again. "You are very polite. What's your name?" "My name? Why, I am Nobody." "Nobody? Well, nobody. I like you. You're a good fellow. And do you know what I am going to do? I am going to save you for last. Yes, I'll eat all your friends first and give you extra time. That's what I'm going to do." Ulysses looked up into the great eye and saw that it was redder than ever. It was all a swimming redness. He had given the monster, who had never drunk spirits before, undiluted wine. Surely it must make him sleepy. But was a gallon enough for his great gullet? Enough to put him to sleep? Or would he want to eat again first? "Eat 'em up. Eat 'em all up, nobody. Save you till later." "Sleep a little first, shall I? Won't try to run away, will you? No. Ha, you can't. Can't open the door, too heavy. Ha, ha. You take nap, too. Nobody, I'll wake you for breakfast. Breakfast." The great body crashed full length on the cave floor, making the very walls of the mountain shake. Polyphemus lay on his back, snoring like a power saw. The sailors were still on the floor, almost dead from fear. "Up!" cried Ulysses. "Stand up like men. Do what must be done, or you will be devoured like the chickens." He got them to their feet and drew them about him as he explained his plan. "Listen now, and listen well, for we do not have time. I made him drunk, but we cannot tell how long it will last." Ulysses thrust his sword into the fire. They saw it glow white hot. "There are 10 of us," he said. 2 of us will 2 of us have been eaten, and one of our friends is still unconscious up there on his shelf of a rock. You 4 get on one side of his head, and the rest on the other side. When I give you the word, lay hold of an ear on your side, each of you, and hang on no matter how he thrashes, for I am going to put out his eye. But if I am going to be sure of my stroke, he must hold his head still. 1 stroke is all I will be allowed." Then Ulysses rolled a boulder next to the giant's head and climbed on it, so that he was looking down into the eye. It was lidless and misted with sleep, big as a furnace door and glowing softly like a banked fire. Ulysses looked at his men. They had done what he had said, broken into 2 parties, 1 group at each ear. He lifted his white-hot sword. "Now!" he cried, driving down with both hands and all the strength of his back and shoulders and all his rage and all his fear. Ulysses stabbed the glowing spike into the giant's eye. His sword jerked out of his hand as the head flailed upward. Men pelted to the ground as they lost their hold. A huge, screeching, curdling bellow split the air. "This way!" shouted Ulysses. He motioned to his men, and they crawled on their bellies toward the far end of the cave, where the herd of goats was tethered. They slipped into the herd and lay among the goats as the giant stomped about the cave, slapping the walls with great blows of his hands, picking up boulders and cracking them together in agony, splitting them to cinders, clutching his eye, a scorched hole now, from which the brown blood gelled. He moaned and gibbered and bellowed in frightful pain. His groping hand found the sailor in the wall, and he tore him to pieces between his fingers. Ulysses could not even hear the man scream because the giant was bellowing so. Now Ulysses saw that the Cyclops' wild stampeding was giving place to a plan, for now he was stamping on the floor in a regular pattern, trying to find and crush them beneath his feet. He stopped moaning and listened. The sudden silence dazed the men with fear. They held their breath and tried to muffle the sound of their beating hearts. All the giant heard was the breathing of the goats. Then Ulysses saw him go to the mouth of the cave and swing the great slab aside and stand there. He realized just in time that the goats would rush outside, which is what the giant wanted, for then he would search the whole cave. Ulysses whispered, "Quickly, swing under the bellies of the rams. Hurry, hurry!" Luckily, they were giant goats and thus able to carry the men who had swung themselves under their bellies and were clinging to the wiry wool. Ulysses himself chose the largest ram. They moved toward the mouth of the cave and crowded through. The Cyclops' hand came down and brushed across the goats' backs, feeling for the men, but the animals were huddled too closely together for him to reach between and search under their bellies. So he let them pass through. Now, the Cyclops rushed to the corner where the goats had been tethered and stamped, searched, and roared through the whole cave again, bellowing with fury when he did not find them. The herd grazed on the slope of the hill beneath the cave. There was a full moon. It was almost as bright as day. "Stay where you are," Ulysses whispered. He heard a crashing, peered out, and saw great shadowy figures converging on the cave. He knew that the other Cyclopses on the island must have heard the noise and had come to see. He heard the giant bellow. The others called to him, "Who has done it? Who has blinded you?" "Nobody. Nobody did it. Nobody blinded me." "Ah, you have done it yourself. What a tragic accident." And they went back to their own caves. "Now," said Ulysses, "follow me." He swung himself out from under the belly of the ram and raced down the hill. The others raced after him. They were halfway across the valley when they heard great footsteps rushing after them, and Polyphemus bellowing nearer and nearer. "He's coming!" cried Ulysses. "Run for your lives!" They ran as they had never run before, but the giant could cover 50 yards at a stride. It was only because he could not see and kept bumping into trees and rocks that they were able to reach the skiff and push out of on the silver water before Polyphemus burst out of the grove of trees and rushed onto the beach. They bent to the oars, and the boat scudded toward the fleet. Polyphemus heard the dip of the oars and the groaning of the oarlocks, and aiming at the sound, hurled huge boulders after them. They fell all around the ship but did not hit. The skiff reached Ulysses' ships, and the sailors climbed aboard. "Haul anchor and away!" cried Ulysses, and they then called out to the Cyclops, "Poor fool, poor blinded, drunken, gluttonous fool. If anyone else asks you, it was not nobody, but Ulysses who has done this to you." But he was to regret that final taunt. The gods honor courage, but punish pride. Polyphemus, wild with rage, waded out chest deep and hurled a last boulder, which hit mid-deck, almost sunk the ship and killed most of the crew, among them 7 of the 9 men who had just escaped. And Polyphemus prayed to Poseidon, God of the sea, I beg you, punish Ulysses for this. Visit him with storm and shipwreck and sorceries. Let him wander many years before he reaches home, and when he gets there, let him find himself forgotten, unwanted, a stranger. Poseidon heard this prayer and made it all happen just that way. All right. We are making our way through this book, guys. We are at Keeper of the Winds. So, yes, it's pretty exciting. All right, give me 1 second here. I am going to go grab something and I will be right back. All right. All right, and I am back and comfy and ready to move forward to Keeper of the Winds. All right, Keeper of the Winds. Now the black ships beat their way northward from the land of the Cyclops, and Ulysses, ignorant of the mighty curse that the blind giant had fastened upon him, was beginning to hope that they might have fair sailing the rest of the way home. So impatient was he that he took the helm himself and kept it night and day, although his sailors pleaded with him to take some rest. But he was wild with eagerness to get home to his wife Penelope and his young son Telemachus, and to the dear land of Ithaca that he had not seen for more than 10 years now. At the end of the third night, just as the first light was straining the sky, he saw something very strange. A wall of bronze, tall and wide, floating on the sea, blocking their way. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, and he rubbed his eyes and looked again. But there it was, a towering, bright wall of beaten bronze. Well, he thought to himself, it cannot stretch across the sea. There must be a way to get around it. He began to sail along the wall as though it were the shore of an island, trying to find his way around. Finally, he came to a huge gate, and even as he gazed upon it in amazement, the gates swung open, and the wind changed abruptly. The shrouds snapped at the sails, bulged, the masts groaned, and all 3 ships of the fleet were blown through the gate, which immediately clanged shut behind them. Once within the wall, the wind fell off, and Ulysses found his ship drifting toward a beautiful hilly island. Suddenly, there was a great howling of wind. The sun was blown out like a candle. Darkness fell upon the waters. Ulysses felt the deck leap beneath him as the ship was lifted halfway out of the water by the ferocious gusts and hurled through the blackness. He tried to shout, but his breath was torn from his mouth, and he lost consciousness. Ulysses had no way of knowing this, but the mischievous Poseidon had guided his ships to the island fortress of Aeolus, Keeper of the Winds. Ages before, when the world was very new, the gods had become fearful of the terrible strength of the winds and had decided to tame them. So Zeus and Poseidon, working together, had floated an island upon the sea and girdled it about with a mighty bronze wall. Then they set a mountain upon the island and hollowed out that mountain until it was a huge stone dungeon. Into this hollow mountain they stuffed the struggling winds and appointed Aeolus as their jailer. And there the winds were held captive. Whenever the gods wanted to stir up a storm and needed a particular wind, they sent a message to Aeolus, who would draw his sword and stab the side of the mountain, making a hole big enough for the wind to fly through. If the north wind were wanted, he stabbed the north side of the mountain, its east slope for the east wind, and so on. When the storm was done, he would whistle the wind home, and the huge brawling gale, broken by its imprisonment, would crawl back, whimpering, to its hole. Aeolus was an enormously fat demigod with a long, wind-tangled beard and a red and wind-beaten face. He loved to eat and drink and fight, play games, and hear stories. 12 children he had, 6 boys and 6 girls. He sent them out one by one, riding the back of the wind around the world, managing the weather for each month. And it was in the great castle of Aeolus that Ulysses and his men found themselves when they awoke from their enchanted sleep. Invisible hands held torches for them, guided them to the baths, anointed them with oil, and gave them fresh clothing. Then the floating torches led them to the dining hall, where they were greeted by Aeolus and his 12 handsome children. A mighty banquet was laid before them, and they ate like starved men. Then Aeolus said, "Strangers, you are my guests uninvited, but guests all the same. By the look of you, you have had adventures and should have fine stories to tell. Yes, I love a tale full of fighting and blood and tricks, and if you have such to tell, then I shall entertain you royally. But if you are such men as to sit dumb and glowering, unwilling to please, using your mouths only to stuff food into, well, then you are apt to find things less pleasant. You, captain," he roared, pointing to Ulysses. "You, sir, I take you for the leader of this somewhat motley crew. Do you have a story to tell?" "For those who know how to listen, I have a tale to tell," said Ulysses. "Your name?" "Ulysses, of Ithaca." Yes," said Aeolus. "I seem to recognize that name. Believe I heard it on Olympus while my uncles and aunts were up there quarreling about some little skirmish they were interested in themselves in. Near Troy, I think it was. Yes. Were you there?" "I was there," said Ulysses. "I was there for 10 years, dear host, and indeed took part in some of that petty skirmishing that will be spoken of by men who love courage when this bronze wall and this island and you and yours have vanished under the sea and have been forgotten for 1,000 years. I am Ulysses. My companions before Troy were Achilles, Menelaus, Agamemnon, mighty heroes all, and in modesty I was not least among them." "Yes," said Aeolus, "you are bold enough, too bold for your own good, perhaps. But you have caught my attention, Captain. I am listening. Tell on." Then Ulysses told of the Trojan War, of the abduction of Helen, and the chase, and the great battles, the attacks, the retreats, the separate duels. He spoke of Achilles fighting Hector and killing him with a spear thrust, of Paris ambushing Achilles, and finally how he himself had made a great hollow wooden horse and had the Greek armies pretend to leave, only to sneak back and hide in the belly of the horse. He told how the Trojans had dragged the horse within their gates, and how the Greek warriors had crept out at night and taken the city and slaughtered their enemies. Aeolus shouted with laughter. His face blazed and his belly shook. "Ah, that's a trick after my own heart," he cried. "You're a sharp one, you are. I know you had a foxy look about you, wooden horse. Ho, 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 ho. Tell more, tell more." Then Ulysses told of his wanderings after the fall of Troy, of his adventure in Lotus Land, and what had happened in the Cyclops cave. And when Aeolus heard how he had outwitted Polyphemus and blinded his single eye, he struck the table with a mighty blow of his fist and shouted, "Marvelous! A master stroke! By the gods, you are the bravest, craftiest warrior that has ever drunk my wine." He was especially pleased because he had always hated Polyphemus. He had no way of knowing, of course, that the blinded Polyphemus had prayed to his father and had laid a curse on Ulysses, and that he, Aeolus, was being made the instrument of that curse. He did not know this, for the gods move in mysterious ways. And so he roared with laughter and shouted, "You have pleased me, Ulysses. You have told me a brave tale, a tale full of blood and tricks, and now I shall grant you any favor within my power. Speak out, Ulysses. Ask what you will." "But one thing I seek, generous Aeolus," said Ulysses, "your help. I need your help in getting home, for it has been a long, weary time since we saw our homes and our families. Our hearts thirst for the sight of Ithaca." "No one can help you better than I," said Aeolus. "You sail on ships, and I am keeper of the winds. Come with me." He led Ulysses out into the night. A hot orange moon rode low in the sky, and they could see without torches. Aeolus led him to the mountain, carrying his sword in one hand and a great leather bag in the other. He stabbed the side of the mountain. There was a rushing, sobbing sound. He clapped his leather bag over the hole, and Ulysses, amazed, saw the great bag flutter and fill. Aeolus held its neck closed, strode to the east face of the mountain, and stabbed again. As the east wind rushed out, he caught it in his sack. Then he stomped to the south side and stabbed again, and caught the south wind in the sack. Now, very carefully, he wound a silver wire around the neck of the sack. It was full now, swollen, tugging at his arm like a huge leather balloon, trying to fly away. He said, "In this bag are the north wind, the south wind, and the east wind. You must keep them prisoner. But if you wish to change course, if a pirate should chase you, say, or a sea monster, or if an adventure beckons, then you open the bag very carefully, you and you alone, Captain, and whistle up the wind you wish. Just let a breath of it out, close it back quickly again, and tie it tight, for winds grow swiftly. That is their secret, and so they must be carefully guarded. I shall not change course, said Ulysses. No matter what enemy threatens or what adventure beckons, I sail straight for Ithaca. I shall not open your bag of winds. Good, said Aeolus. Then bind it to your mast and guard it yourself, sword in hand. Let none of your men approach it, lest they open it unwittingly. In the meantime, I will send the gentle west wind to follow your ship and fill your sails and take you home. Thank you, great Aeolus. Thank you kindly, keeper of the winds. I know now that the gods have answered my prayers, and I shall be able to cease this weary, heartbreaking drifting over the face of the sea. Having my men killed and eaten, my ships destroyed, and my hopes shattered, I will never cease thanking you, Aeolus, till the day I die. May that sad occasion be far off, said Aeolus politely. Now, sir, much as I like your company, you had better gather your men and be off. I shall be uneasy now until my winds return to me, and I can shut them in the mountain again. Ulysses returned to the castle and called together his men. Gladly they trooped down to their ships and went aboard. Ulysses bound the great leather sack to the mast and warned his crew that no man must touch it on pain of death. Then he himself stood with naked sword under the mast guarding the sack. Up anchor, he cried. The west wind rolled off the mountain and filled their sails. The black ships slipped out of the harbor. Away from the mountain island they sailed, away from the mountain and the castle toward the wall of bronze. When they reached the wall, the great gates swung open, and they sailed westward over water oily with moonlight. Westward they sailed for 9 days and 9 nights. In perfect weather they skimmed along, the west wind hovering behind them, keeping their sails full, pushing them steadily home. And for 9 nights and 9 days Ulysses did not sleep. He did not close his eyes or sheath his sword. He kept his station under the mast. Food and drink were brought to him there, and never for an instant stopped guarding the sack. Then finally, on the morning of the 9th day, he heard the lookout cry, "Land ho!" and strained his eyes to see. What he saw made his heart swell. Tears coursed down his face, but they were tears of joy, for he saw the dear familiar hills of home. He saw the brown fields of Ithaca, the twisted olive trees, and as he watched, he saw them even more clearly, saw the white marble columns of his own castle on the cliff, and his men watching saw the smoke rising from their own chimneys. When Ulysses saw the white columns of his palace, he knew that unless the west wind failed, they would be home in an hour. But the friendly wind blew steadily as ever. Ulysses heaved a great sigh. The terrible tension that had kept him awake for 9 days and nights eased its grip. He raised his arms and yawned. Then he leaned against the mast and closed his eyes, just for a minute. 2 of the men standing in the bow saw him slump at the foot of the mast, fast asleep. Their eyes traveled up the mast to the great leather bag, plump as a balloon, straining against its bonds as the impatient winds rustled inside. Then Poseidon, swimming invisibly alongside, clicked his golden armlets. The men heard the clicking and thought it came from the bag. One man said to the other, "Do you hear that? Those are coins, heavy golden coins clicking against each other. There must be a fortune in that sack." The other man said, "Yes, a fortune that should belong to all of us by rights. We shared the danger, and we should share the loot." "It is true," said the first, "that he has always been generous. He shared the spoils of Troy." "Yes, but that was then. Why does he not divide this great sack of treasure? Aeolus gave it to him, and we know how rich he is. Aeolus gave it to him as a guest gift, and he should share it with us." "You never will. Whatever is in that bag, he does not mean for us to see it. Did you not observe how he has been guarding it all these nights and all these days, standing there always, eating and drinking where he stands, never sheathing his sword?" "It is in its sheath now," said the second sailor, "and his eyes are closed. Look, he sleeps like a babe. I doubt that anything would wake him." "What are you doing? What are you going to do with that knife? Are you out of your mind?" "Yes, out of my mind with curiosity. Out of my mind with gold fever, if you must know. Ulysses lies asleep. His sword sleeps in its sheath, and I mean to see what is in that bag." "Wait, I'll help you, but you must give me half." "Come then." Swiftly and silently, the 2 barefooted sailors padded to the mast, slashed the rope that bound the bag on the spar, and bore it away. "Hurry, open it!" "I can't. This wire's twisted in a strange knot, perhaps a magic knot. It won't come out." "Then we'll do it this way," cried the sailor. with a knife, and he struck at the leather bag, slashing it open. He was immediately lifted off of his feet and blown like a leaf off the deck and into the sea as the winds rushed howling out of the bag and began to chase each other around the ship. The winds screamed and jeered and laughed, growing, leaping, reveling in their freedom, roaring and squabbling, screeching around and around the ship. They fell on their gentle brother, the west wind, and cuffed him mercilessly until he fled. Then they chased each other around the ship again, spinning like a cork in a whirlpool. Then, as they heard the far summoning whistle of the Keeper of the Winds, far to the west, on the Aeolian Sea, they snarled with rage and roared boisterously homeward, snatching the ships along with them, ripping their sails to shreds, snapping their masts like twigs, and hurling the splintered hulls westward over the boiling sea. Ulysses awoke from his sleep to find the blue sky black with clouds, and his home island dropping far astern out of sight. He saw his crew flung about the deck like dolls, and the tattered sails and the broken spars, and he did not know whether he was awake or asleep, whether this was some nightmare of loss, or whether he was awake now and had slept before, dreaming a fair dream of home. Whichever it was, he began to understand that he was being made the plaything of great powers. With the unleashed winds screaming behind him at gale force, the trip back to where they had started took them only 2 days. And once again the black ships were hurled onto the island of the winds. Ulysses left his crew on the beach and went to the castle. He found Aeolus in his throne room and stood before him, bruised, bloody, clothes torn, eyes like ashes. "What happened?" cried Aeolus. "Why have you come back?" "I was betrayed," said Ulysses. "Betrayed by sleep, the most cruel sleep of my life, and then by a wicked, foolish, greedy crew who released the winds from the sack and let us be snatched away from happiness, even as we saw the smoke rising from our own chimneys." "I warned you," said Aeolus. "I warned you not to let anyone touch that bag." "And you were right, 1,000 times right," cried Ulysses. "Be generous once again. You can heal my woes. You alone. Renew your gift. Lend me the west wind to bear me home again, and I swear to you that this time I shall do everything you bid." "I can't help you," said Aeolus. "No one can help he who the gods detest, and they detest you. Man, they hate you. What you call bad luck is their hatred, turning gifts into punishment, fair hopes into nightmares, and bad luck is very catching, so please go. Get on your ship and sail away from this island and never return." "Farewell," said Ulysses, and he strode away. He gathered his weary men and made them board the ships again. The winds were pent in their mountain. The sea was sluggish. A heavy calm lay over the harbor. They had to row their broken stumps of oars, crawling like beetles over the gray water. They rowed away from the island, through the bronze gate, and out upon the sullen sea. And Ulysses, heartbroken, almost dead of grief, tried to hide his feelings from the men. He stood on deck, barking orders, making the men sail, patch hull, rig new spars, and keep rowing. He took the helm himself and swung the tiller, pointing the bow westward toward home, which, once again, lay at the other end of the sea. All right. We are at Cannibal Beach. All right. Ulysses wished to put as much open water as possible between him and the islands of the winds. But after 6 days, he realized he would have to put into harbor. His ships were in very poor trim. Their hulls were gashed and splintered, the sails tattered, and the men themselves were cut and bruised and half dead with fatigue. It was a terrible punishment his fleet had taken from the brawling winds. As dusk was thickening, they made a landfall. The side of the island pleased Ulysses. It seemed perfect for his purpose. It had a natural basin of tideless water, cupped by a smooth, curved outcropping of rock, and as they sailed through the narrow throat of rock into the harbor, they saw a marvelous sight. The purple sky deepened to inky blue, to black, then swiftly paled. Orange bars of fire stood in the sky, then a great flooding of golden light, which purpled again and went dark. Ulysses searched the sky. He had never seen anything like this before. For night followed day upon his island like a hound hunting a deer. The sun chased the moon across the bowl of the sky, and the beach darkened and went light again, moved from bright day to blackest night in the time that it takes to eat a meal. "This is a wonder," said Ulysses to himself, "and truly all my life I have sought wonders, but just now I would wish for a more ordinary course of events. All strangeness holds danger now, and we have had our belly full of adventure for the time. What I pray for now is a space of days, without surprise or wild encounter, to have a fair wind and a calm sea and a swift voyage home. Alas, I fear it is not yet to be. I fear this island of the racing sun. And yet I must land here and mend my ships and rest my crew. The Greek warriors beached their ships and dragged themselves onto the shore. But according to his prudent custom, Ulysses beached only 2 ships, keeping one moored in the harbor in the event of an attack. Ulysses spoke his orders. The men broke into groups and began to work. Some built fires and began to cook food. Others mended sail, some caulked hulls, and sentries kept watch. Climb that tall tree there, Ulysses said to one of his men. Climb to the top and look about, then come down and tell me what you see. It's too dark to see, said the sailor. You forget where we are, said Ulysses. Here night chases day, and day pursues night. There will be light enough by the time you reach the top. The man went off to climb the tree. Ulysses stalked about, inspecting the work being done on the ships. The sky paled, dawn bloomed, but the sailor had not returned. Odd, said Ulysses. He must be asleep up there, and he dispatched another sailor to climb the tree to see what happened to the first one. The shadows were lengthening. The sky shed its gold, shadows yawned and swallowed the light. It was night, and the second sailor had not returned. Ulysses frowned and sent a third man to climb the tree. Then he kept guard there on the beach, in the firelight, eyes narrowed, beard bristling like a great cat waiting. The sun minted itself again in the sky, morning flashed. The third sailor had not returned. Ulysses decided to climb the tree himself. It was a good half-mile from where he stood, a huge solitary tree stretching up. When he reached it, he saw that its bark was wrinkled in a most curious way. It fell in soft, brown folds, unlike any bark he had ever seen, and when he grasped the tree to climb it, the bark felt like a heavy cloth beneath his hands. But it made climbing easy. Up and up he went, up and up in the thickening darkness, climbing with the ease of a man of the middle sea who had begun to climb mass as soon as he could walk. He climbed and climbed, rested, climbed again. Suddenly he heard a mumbling, chuckling sound, as if some beast were crouching in the branches above. He stopped climbing and peered upward. He could see no branches. Reaching up, he felt a hairy foliage grazing his fingers. He clung there to the branch right where he was, not moving, until the blackness thinned and he began to see. He had been climbing through darkness now. He saw against the paler sky toward what he had been climbing. The hairy foliage was a beard, a huge, bushy beard hanging some 40 feet above the ground. Above that beard was a grinning of enormous teeth. Above the teeth, the muddy gleam of eyes as large as portholes. Ulysses' head swam with fear. Fear pried at his arms and legs, and he had to clutch the trunk with all of his strength to keep from falling. But it was no trunk. He had been climbing no tree. It was a giant's leg he had been climbing, and the cloth-like bark was cloth indeed, and the stuff of its garments. And he realized then that the 3 sailors he had sent aloft had climbed into a mumbling death. Ulysses thanked the gods then that he had begun his climb in darkness, for he understood that the giant slept standing, like a horse, and that his eyes were not yet adjusted to the new light. That is why the huge slab of hand he saw swinging there now had not trapped him like a fly. He loosened his grasp and slid down so swiftly that he tore the skin off his hands. But he was mindless of pain. He hit the ground and raised a great shout. "To the ships!" he cried. "To the ships!" But it was too late. The sun was burning in the sky, and there was too much light. A brutal, bellowing yell shattered the air, and the men, paralyzed with fear, whimpering like puppies, saw a mob of giants, tall as trees, trooping toward them over the hills. And before Ulysses could rally his terrified men, the giants were upon them, trampling the ships like twigs, scooping the men up and popping them into their mouths like children eating berries. Ulysses did not lose his wits. Fear turned to anger in him, and his anger became an icy flame that quickened him. His sword was scything through the air. He hacked away at the giant hands that came at him like a flock of huge meaty gulls. He whipped his blade at their fingers, hacking them off at the knuckled joints. His sword smoked with blood. Inspired by the sight of him fencing with the giant fingers, a small group of his men gathered around and made a hedge of steel. They hacked their way through the great grasping hands to the edge of the sea. then followed Ulysses into the water and swam to the single ship that they had left moored in the harbor. Luckily, the swift night was falling again, and they were shielded by darkness. They heard the huge snuffling noise of the giants feasting upon their shipmates. There was nothing they could do except try to save themselves. The night had brought out an offshore wind. Swiftly they raised sail and darted through the throat of rock out into the open sea. Of the 3 ships that had gone in, only one sailed away. Of the 3 crews, but one was left. The others had gone down the gullets of the giants who lived on that strange island where night hounds the golden stag of the day across the indifferent sky. Right, there's the end of Cannibal Island. Oh no, Cannibal Beach. Sorry, Cannibal Beach. All right, that's where I'm gonna pause the Adventures of Ulysses for tonight. We made our way through quite a few chapters here. Quite a few. We went through the prologue, Ships and Men, the Zirconians, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops' Cave, Keeper of the Winds, and Cannibal Beach. So I will pick this back up on Friday. Please come and check it out. Check out my YouTube page. Give it a subscribe, a like. If you have any questions, please let me know. If I slaughtered one of the names or one of the places in this book, please let me know. I love to learn. I love to know what I'm doing and what I'm doing wrong. If you like it, please let me know. I will keep doing it. After we get through this one, I have a Sherlock Holmes book that I'm going to read. So if that's more your style, come back here in a few days. I don't think it's going to take us much more than a couple days to get through this one. We're working through it pretty quickly. So, yeah, check it out, and I will talk to you guys later. Happy reading. Bye.